Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Halal Gap. I'm your host, Sofia Alani, and I'm joined by my co host, Sikandar Atiq. If you guys have enjoyed our episodes of the Halal Gap so far and want to make sure not to miss the next one, please follow us on Apple and Spotify and leave us a review. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe to our channel. Are you looking to sharpen your skills ahead of your next big project? Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of classes for creative and curious people on topics including illustration, design, photography, video, freelancing, and more. Sign up for Skillshare today and get a free month off by clicking the link in the bottom of the description of this episode. We have an incredible guest joining us today. Take it away, Sikandar.
He is a writer, lecturer, and filmmaker who has been committed to peace and interfaith understanding his entire career. He's the co-founder of Unity Production Foundation, a media and educational nonprofit whose mission is increasing religious and cultural pluralism. He's a producer and director of UPF's new series, The Great Muslim American Road Trip, which follows 2019 Mosquers headliner Mona Haider and her husband Sebastian on a cross-country journey along the historic Route 66. Joining us from DC, please welcome Alex Kronemer.
Woo! All right. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being a part of this. And thank you for kicking off season 4 of the podcast with us. So with all of our guests, we like to start right kind of at the beginning. So, we know you grew up in a small steel town in Pennsylvania and would go on to become one of the most important voices in the pursuit of interfaith understanding. So where did that passion for religious bridge building and interfaith dialogue come from? I mean, it's maybe my own naivety, but I wouldn't expect a small steel town in Pennsylvania to be sort of that cultural melting pot. So was it prevalent in your home growing up, or where did that come from?
Well, actually, we hear a lot about the clash of civilizations, and I kind of grew up in the clash of civilizations in the sense that small steel town was extremely religiously diverse, but not in a good way. I mean, it was very segmented. There was Eastern Orthodox, there were Catholics, there were Protestants of different kinds. At some point in my teenage years, the evangelical church opened up, and to a large extent, there was a lot of kind of divisions, and particularly when the evangelical church came, a lot of kind of animosities that existed in that little town. In addition, in my own home, my father was Jewish and my mother was Christian, and they divorced in part over religion. So religious conflict was a part of my home. Religious conflict was a part of the environment that I grew up in. And in fact, largely because of for a number of years, by the time I was a senior in high school, I just was fed up with religion. Religion was doing nothing but bad things in my world. And so I became kind of an atheist for several years, actually, throughout most of my college time, because I just didn't want to have anything to do with religion. But I kind of had a spiritual yearning. It never, even during those periods of where I was kind of a very hostile atheist in some ways, I still had a spiritual yearning that was not being satisfied. And so I felt by the time I was a senior in college that I needed to, maybe I needed to really try to find a place where I thought my religion I could park my spirituality in some religion. I just felt that was necessary. So I was studying international relations, economics. I wanted to have a career in the State Department, but I thought that this was important personally. So I kind of shifted gears. I went to Harvard Divinity School to study comparative religion. And while I was doing that, I was attending various churches and synagogues, and I even went to a Hare Krishna group for a little while. I mean, I was really trying to find a spot where I found comfortable. And at one point, somebody actually who was a Unitarian Universalist minister who I had been talking to recommended that I go to this mosque that was in Boston, outside of Boston, a little town called Quincy, Massachusetts. And I thought that was like the most ridiculous suggestion, because the Iranian hostage crisis had just ended a year or two earlier. And all I knew of Islam was these very frightening pictures of people chanting "Death to America." But anyway, I decided, for the sake of just crossing it off, I'd go. And I went. And it was during Ramadan. And it's a kind of a long story, but a long story short, I was in the back of the mosque, just sort of observing things. I was about actually to leave. I didn't know anything about what happens in a mosque when the call for prayer happens, breaking the fast. And a guy comes out and he's giving out dates to everybody. And I was kind of hiding in the corner, so he missed me. And I started like, what is he giving to everybody? And I was looking to try to see what it was. And it was a a date. And the guy whose hand I was looking at made eye contact with me. And then I remember he looked directly at my hand, which was empty. And suddenly he takes one of these two dates, he leans over and he gives it to me. And I was very struck by that. I mean, here's a guy who's been fasting all day, all night. It was back in the time, it was 33 years ago. So it was around this time. He had just given me one of these tiny pieces of fruit that he had been given. And he didn't even know me. And so I just had this realization or this feeling suddenly that there was a spirit of generosity in Islam that I didn't know existed. And I kind of went back and I opened up a Quran for the first time, and I happened to turn to a page that talked about Christians, Muslims, and Jews all being able to enter the kingdom of heaven as long as you did good and believed in God and those kinds of things. And so suddenly that all that conflict that I had been living through and I had left behind or tried to leave behind was in a way healed in just reading that passage. Like here was a religion that kind of combined them all. Here was a religion that wasn't saying if you're not fitting in my box, if you don't have my faith statement, you're going to hell. And so, I just said, this is a place where I feel that I could park my faith. And so I did, kind of naively, because I didn't realize how much prejudice and bias there was against Muslims at that moment, even though I myself had some, but I didn't realize how much the world did and how much conflict there was around these issues, particularly in society in America. So that kind of why I started doing interfaith work. It was sort of the feeling that I had been sort of running away from the clash of civilizations my entire life. I had thought I found a faith where I could finally feel peace, and it wasn't. So it was, to me, like I needed to do something, and that's how it all began.
And so prior to your kind of introduction to Islam and kind of connecting with it on a spiritual level personally, had the interfaith thing ever crossed your mind, or it was very much kind of part and parcel with discovering that there was a possibility of doing
No,
this?
not really. I mean, I didn't, throughout my college years, you have to keep in mind I was studying economics and international relations, and God doesn't play a very big role in either one of those things. So thoughts of interfaith this or interfaith that was never really a part of the world that I was studying in. And let's keep in mind, I'm a bit older than both of you, so we're talking about the late 70s, early 80s. People really didn't talk about interfaith that much in those days. So no, it really wasn't a part. In fact, when I began doing interfaith work, I was doing it before I had a name for what it was. You know what I'm saying? So it really wasn't on my mind. I mean, what was on my mind in college was that, I mean, to be honest, was that I just felt that religion was something that divided people, and didn't. There was nothing unifying about it at all, and that division had been, as I said, both in my personal life, but also in this town. See, the funny thing was, I was a paper boy for most of my childhood, and so I would deliver papers through this little town, and I would interact with all these different people, these different faiths, and suddenly I would be hearing from one how the little old lady two doors down was going to hell because she didn't go to my church, how this and that. You know what I'm trying to say? So it was, to me, religion was a divisive thing. It wasn't something unifying. And the glimpse I had of how religion could be unifying that came from reading that first passage that I encountered in the Quran, again, was like a dim light in the darkness that I just wanted to start pursuing. And that was the beginning of my interfaith journey.
So then kind of when going into your policy work then, using your degree and kind of then this newfound interest in the interfaith work, can you talk a little bit about what you hoped to do and like why specifically you went to like federal government level to do that?
Yeah, well, so you're pointing out what was my career. So for 10 years or so before I began this work in filmmaking and directly involved in this, I worked in the federal government. I was an economist for a number of years. Then I was part of Al Gore's Reinventing Government team. Really, almost the best job I've ever had. And then I was in the State Department, working with the new Office of Religious Freedom, but also in the what was it called? The department, the agency in the State Department that was involved with human rights, and I had the Middle East desk. for that group. So I was doing a lot of work in the government during that time. But sometimes people talk about religious calling, and I can only describe my work into interfaith being like that, because it wasn't like I wanted to have a career in the State Department. That was in the government. That was what I wanted to do. That's what I studied. I took this little break to try to find a religion. I went right back to that. That's the work I started doing immediately after divinity school. But I kept feeling pulled. I kept feeling, and there was like I wrote a couple articles that got published. Those articles led to me being invited to be a speaker here and speaker there. I started, I got on this interview list where I started being interviewed. So more and more, I kept finding that I was being called upon to explain Islam, to talk about interfaith issues, even though I was really trying to pursue a career doing something in the government. But I kept being called to do this, and then it all manifested finally when I was invited by the Saudi government when they were opening up the Hajj for the first time for world journalists. Because I'd written and I'd come some notoriety, I was invited to be one of those 70 or so journalists who were invited to cover the Hajj that year. And it was there that I met a few people who, kind of, I always say, took me on a backstage tour of the Hajj, and took me to places where this is where the Prophet Muhammad did this, and this is where that happened. And all of a sudden I just had this vision of, wow, we could make a documentary about the Prophet Muhammad. And I didn't really know, I mean, I knew the outlines of the story, but I didn't know the story in detail. And as I started learning the story in detail, it occurred to me that, in a way, he was like the quintessential American hero, and he's somebody who is sticking with his principles. He's living in a bad time. He rights the wrongs, and then he rides out of town at the end. And, like a Western hero. And so it just struck me that, hey, not only would it be informative and help heal some of the misunderstandings that existed, but also it's just a great story that I thought there would be an audience for. And that's really was the thing that then started taking me fully in the direction of doing the interfaith work, particularly through film, that I've been doing for the last 20 years.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, Alex, so it's more of a question than anything, but how much of that transition to filmmaking was due, if any, was due to thinking that within the power of storytelling, you might be able to accomplish some of that interfaith dialogue, some of that, helping to dispel those misconceptions? Was that an easier path with filmmaking than, for example, the slow moving beast that is bureaucracy and policy making? Or was that any part of your decision making process?
Well, I came to an insight during this period, and the insight was this: science says that humans are made of molecules, right? But they're wrong. Humans are made of stories. We are storytelling animals. We live in stories. We tell ourselves stories. We create narratives to explain, like I just told you a narrative about my life from one point to the other. But I'm imposing that on that. There's a lot of other things that happened, right? But I'm imposing a certain story arc on that. We communicate in stories. We dream in stories. We are storytelling animals. And so it was when I began doing this interfaith work, and I started doing the television stuff in the earliest phases, I recognized that, telling people in an informative way about this, that, or the other thing talks to the mind. But you tell a person's story, it talks to the heart. And it's just more powerful. And the information that you're trying to convey sticks. And don't get me wrong. I mean, in my time at the State Department, I made an impact. I was able to impact a lot of policy, and I have to say I did think about that hard before I left to do the filmmaking, because there was a sense of, I'm in a position here where I'm actually making things happen that are important. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, the truth of the matter is, and this is what finally convinced me to do it, is it's not like if I left a job that it was over. Somebody else would do that same job. They may do it differently than I did,
Right.
maybe better in some ways, maybe worse in some ways, but it would still get done. There would still be a
Mhm.
Middle East desk officer. There would still be somebody working for religious freedom.
Mhm.
But this work was only going to happen if I did it.
Yeah.
And so that was what finally made me say, I'm going to change from being in the policymaking world to being in the storytelling business. And
Mhm.
that was why I made that shift.
Mhm. That's awesome. And I think like one question that I have with regards to your knowledge of both the policy kind of field and the film field is I feel like the United States is very specifically an interesting case where the media and policy are like quite interlinked in the sense that like over the years the enemies of the state of like the US government are often then the antagonists in like movies and TV and stuff. And so I just wonder, like, that's like a very interesting thing to me because I don't know that I see that elsewhere as much as kind of in who is chosen to be like the bad guy in a certain way and like in a certain time with media that comes out of Hollywood. And so like what are your thoughts on that, having knowledge from both the
Yeah.
policy and kind of political side and the film side of that?
Yeah. So you presented this as sort of like, hey, the United States has certain policies or certain enemies, and then that filters down to the culture. It really is the other way around.
Mm,
It's the culture that sets the policies. It's the
Interesting.
stories that sets the scope of what it is that policymakers do. I mean, I sat in my time there, I sat in hundreds of meetings and heard hundreds of things described. And these are people to a large degree whose entire information about, in this case, Muslims, other topics as well, but in this case, Muslims and Arabs particularly, came from the images they grew up with.
mhm,
So they came into policy making roles with this received knowledge from the stories they had heard. Not everybody can go and become a interfaith scholar. Not everybody in a position of power can learn who this is or what that is or what this really means, etc. Right? They come into it with knowledge, with a sense of this thing from the stories that they've heard. So the culture sets the policy more than anything else, right?
mm,
So once upon a time, again, I'm older than you, but there was a period of time where the bad guy was the Russians, you know,
mhm,
and to a large degree that also influenced the policy was being made,
mhm,
and things then switch and other things happen. So the work that I'm doing, in a way, I still feel is policymaking work because, in as much as the stories can be better. His stories can be more nuanced. There can be a deeper understanding of things. Can't but influence decision makers. And there's a huge audience for our work. I mean, when at least two of our documentaries were eagerly so, requested by the State Department, by Department of Defense, by others who really knew that they didn't know very much about this topic and they needed to know more. Right.
mhm,
So, being able to have a group like that, seeing the kind of presentation we make versus a story that would be very anti-Muslim or anti-Arab, it would portray people, would influence decisions that those people later make.
mhm.
So, in a way, I'm still involved in policy making, though not
Yeah.
directly.
And do you feel like there's other folks who are involved in this type of storytelling who like need to be more conscious of that? Because I feel like I 100% agree, and I wonder like is that maybe something of a conversation to have with folks who are making content right now in terms of the responsibility that
Yeah,
carries?
part of what so we make films, and we also, maybe pre-COVID at least, did a lot of work in Hollywood as well, working
Mhm,
with writers and producers, and and um, and I like to believe that some of that work is bearing fruit. We're seeing a lot of positive portrayals of Muslims now in television.
mhm,
Miss Marvel
Yep.
is an
mhm,
example of that. And so, but there's others. I mean, in Canada, you had the transplant, for
Yeah.
mhm,
example,
Absolutely.
and other shows as well. And we've worked directly with some of those shows. But I will say that, and I won't say who because it was a confidential conversation, but a very high um level producer who's responsible for a lot of television at one point several years ago kind of said that he felt bad uh, because he realized that he had just, made a lot of stories with Muslim bad guys.
Mhm.
And he was seeing how that was having a negative effect, particularly in a post 9/11 world.
Mhm.
They didn't need additional portrayals of negativity to motivate people's prejudice. And he recognized that, and was determined, and he did, in fact, make different kind of content that kind of abandoned that. So yes, I mean, I do feel like, I mean, that's part of what we've been doing too, is trying to um, connect with other content makers, um, to, just to try to create that awareness. But it's very hard. We were talking about economics a few minutes ago. I mean, the thing that controls these decisions to a large degree is money,
Mhm.
Yeah.
and stories that have fear as a part of them, and you know black and white bad guys and good guys, sell,
Yeah.
and it's hard for many to resist the temptation of just, digging into the bag of tropes and cliches
Yeah.
and just telling that story, because
Yeah.
we know that story sells, right?
Yeah.
So that's the challenge. But I mean, one of the things that we've been trying to do in Hollywood, and even in our own work, is just demonstrating that, hey, look, telling a story that's balanced, or telling a story that isn't just cliched, um, also sells. People like that. Miss Marvel, for example, is a very popular show, and that might have been a hard show, or maybe even unimaginable to see a show like that on TV 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But things
Yeah.
are changing, and with the success of that show, I can guarantee you there'll be other shows like
Mhm.
that, because money talks. And if you're getting the audience, you're getting the advertising dollars, there's a desire for more of that content.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, we've had this conversation quite a lot over the last few years about how, there's the art side of the equation and there's the business side of the equation. And I think, as for Muslim representation, it's important to understand both sides of that coin in order to find success within the mainstream media. And so, groups like Most through your organization, and obviously MPAC and a bunch of others have been paving the way to help
Yeah.
do the production work as well as obviously the greasing of the wheels on the creative work. So no, I totally agree with you, especially with, like you said, the success of those non-trope those more nuanced representations of Muslims that are not just perpetrators or victims of violence. Then hopefully that's what's going to create.
Yeah, and it doesn't. I mean, and it doesn't mean that you're swinging the pendulum the other way, and
Yeah.
portraying a saintly vision. You may
No.
remember a show that was on HBO a few years ago with Riz Ahmed, who's now a very big
Yeah.
Hollywood
Tonight up.
figure,
Yeah.
called The Night Of, right? So there was this character. He was arrested for murder. He ends up having all kinds of pretty bad experiences,
Yeah.
and at the end of it, he's a drug addict, right? So it
Yeah.
wasn't a sanitized version, but it was a real version, and you
Totally.
and you became, as the audience member, invested in his story, right?
Mhm.
Absolutely.
And you invested in him, and that's the kind of thing that we're talking about. Like, we're not going to say, oh, we're going to have, and this is actually one of the challenges for Muslim filmmakers and Muslim content makers, because there is a tendency to want to portray a very saintly and sanitized vision of Muslims,
Mhm.
in part
Yeah.
because, you know, as an anecdote to some of the negative portrayals, but in part because within the Islamic context, there's reluctance to show bad things. There's
Yeah.
feelings, Islam is not a culture; it's a religion, and the religion stands for certain things. So if you're having a character who drinks alcohol or something like that, suddenly that becomes challenging for a content maker to do, right? And
Mhm.
and so that also needs to be addressed. In other words, people who are themselves Muslim who are making this content also have to recognize that not only do you not want to do we want to battle or fight against the negative tropes, but if you swing completely in the other direction, you're going to make programs that no one's going to want to watch.
Totally.
Mhm.
It's going to
Totally.
be it's going to seem preachy or
Yeah.
uninteresting. You're not
Well,
doing a character who has challenges.
it goes back to that nuance, right? And I think that's the thing that we've all been talking about is we don't just want representation anymore. We want that nuanced representation, that holistic representation. I remember, our very first episode of the Halal Gap was with our friend Rami Youssef about, his show. And one of the questions was asked was, how do you deal with that idea in Islam about hiding your sins, right? He's very upfront about his sins on the show. And, I think something that he said which resonates is the fact that, with a show like that, it's about an individual and his journey, which includes obviously a very important part of him, which is his faith. And I think if we can showcase more stories like that, where
Yeah,
Muslims are seen as individuals, as well as obviously a piece of this collective, religion and community, I think that's where you start to get that more nuanced representation, which is
yeah,
hopefully just the start.
absolutely.
So, yeah. And so a question I had, Alex, going back to your specific journey and career here. Um, much of your work has been in the documentary world, but then recently you did a more narrative project called Lamya's Poem. Talk to us a little bit about, first of all, why the documentary is a medium that you first gravitated towards and continue to gravitate towards, and then why you felt it was necessary to make that switch towards the narrative project.
Yeah, I mean, um, uh, the the documentary work. First of all, if you've seen our films, you'll know that we make our documentaries in a very cinematic way. So they're not kind of straight on. I'm to I don't want to say boring, but they're not just informative talking head, talking head. We have action scenes, we have costumes, we have actors, we have things happening, and we try to produce those at a very high level to make those stories come alive. Uh, that said, a documentary is a lot less expensive to produce
Mm.
than a feature film. I mean, it's like mathematics. It's like every minute of acting equals a certain amount of costuming, art design. You go down the list, and they'll always have price tags attached.
Mm-hmm.
So in telling a story in a documentary format, we can have 2 minutes of action, and then we can have a scholar or an expert saying, and then the next he traveled here and got to that camp, and so we don't have to show a boat, and we don't have to show. So it's just like all those other things. The price tag, of an interview is very cheap, right? So
Yeah.
so you have an hour-long program, and maybe 20 minutes of it is action, and 40 minutes of it is more description and photographs or artwork or something like that. And so this makes it affordable as an independent producer. So when we were starting out as independent producers, again, there was nobody in Hollywood, no network, nobody was going to support anything we were going to do. We had to raise the money, and we just recognized that we could raise a certain amount, uh, and probably no more than that. So it was sort of our budget determined the format. But that said, um, uh, many of our documentaries, because they're on TV, because they're on PBS particularly, get much bigger audiences than movies, even some big movies, because movies out for 2-3 weeks. Our shows when they're on PBS has them for 3 years. They're rebroadcast many times. The current film that we have uh, it has something like 2,000 broadcasts across the
Wow.
country, across America. So people, you have all those times where people can come and watch it. Plus, because it's television, people aren't paying money. There's not any of those things. So we get really large audiences for these films as well. Kind of like the needs, the restrictions determine the format to a large degree. Now, when Lamia's poem came along, it began with a documentary idea,
Right.
but um, and the documentary idea was trying to do something about Rumi.
Right.
But like it, just one thing led to the other, and the big impact or the big changing moment was encountering a story of some refugees, Syrian refugees, um, in a Greek park, who were reading Rumi. And the story just went on to say how they had brought with them books as they were escaping and just grabbing some clothes and stuff. They had grabbed some cherished books, and they were forming little book clubs, and they were little libraries, and it was just like, wow, the power of stories, the power of literature to help people through difficult times, and the power of Rumi, who I didn't know that much about. And then when I started reading a little bit about Rumi, because I was just so intrigued by this, find out what this dude was he was a refugee. He was fleeing the Mongol invasion for 7 years. He was a displaced person, and it made me suddenly have an insight into his poetry, because his poetry often really starts in a place of loss. And I never really saw that, because I was always focused on like the uplifting part. I was never focused too much on the part that begins with loss, like the beginning of Masnavi, the flute that's torn from the reed bed and separated from its home, and it plays such a sad song. You know, he was talking about himself. He was that reed torn from the reed bed, right? So when I kind of had that thought, it just like the story, the fictional story of a Syrian girl, 12 years old, became her age, who's given a book of Rumi's poetry that becomes a magical gateway where she meets Rumi as a boy when he was fleeing the violence of his time, and helps him write the poem that 800 years later saves her life. Well, that wasn't a documentary. That was a story. And because of the fantasy elements of it, it just struck me that was an animated story. So, we just started, wrote a script and started trying to find the right place, the right partners. And we ended up actually producing it in Canada with a studio in Ontario called Pip Animation, who were really taken by the story. And anyway, they did a good job with it. And COVID it hasn't been released in North America yet because of COVID largely. But as this is beginning to clear and theaters are opening, and there was a huge backlog of films that had been waiting to come out, as that's been now moving through the pipeline, we're hopeful that we'll see something, a release in North America next year. Though we are getting international releases. We've gotten a number of places outside of North America that are beginning to distribute the film.
Right on. And Canadian lead actor in Mina Masood, who's probably best
Well,
known as.
all the actors are the lead actor, but almost all of the actors were Canadian.
Oh, right on.
Voice actors, yeah.
There you go. There you go.
No, it was a lot of Canadian talent that went into making that film.
Fantastic. Right on.
That's awesome. And I just wanted to ask, like, you kind of mentioned having your stuff on PBS and how like that accessibility really, how important is that to you in terms of like if you were to continue and make more feature films and make more things that aren't documentaries that will be on a specifically publicly available broadcasting system, is that something that you would like to keep as like a tenant and like a value of your work and going forward?
You mean continuing to do documentary films?
Or
Is
just
that?
like having them be accessible, because I think you talked a lot about like how it's like it's on TV, it's free,
Oh,
like,
I see what
and
you're
I
saying.
think
Yes.
that a lot, like a lot of the time, like the media that is, it can be gate kept in a certain way. Like some parts of this educational, like really empathy inducing stuff can be gate kept in a
Yes.
certain
Yes.
way.
Yes. So I am in development. I can't tell you any details, but I am in development with another narrative film that would be possibly on Netflix or one of the streaming services. So that would be a continuation of a television, but a narrative that would be bringing those things together. And since they would be paying for it, money's not. I don't have to raise the money. So
Yeah.
Right on.
so
Awesome.
stay tuned. Maybe season 5. I'll talk to you about that show.
Come back
Yeah,
and tell us about that one.
definitely.
Okay.
Pencil you now. And I know, like, in the research that our wonderful producer Asif had done, there was a project called the 20,000 Dialogues that you
Yes.
had done with your company. And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about that, but I had some questions about specifically the survey that you offered to folks who came and participated in these like film book clubs. And how did you kind of guarantee a diverse audience? Because I think it's very easy to just find the people who already agree with you. So what kind
Yeah.
of steps did you take to find folks who didn't?
So $20,000 was one of probably 3 or 4 dozen different outreach projects that we launched, and we did that because, um, you know, television happens, but unless someone tunes on the TV and watches, they don't get the benefit of the story. So we've designed more or less an educational outreach project around every film we've ever done, trying to target the kinds of people we think would be interested in that film. Okay, and 20,000 Dialogues was one of those, and it was built around our first 2 or 3 films, and the idea of 20,000 Dialogues was, as it may say, the title was the idea, was trying to have 20,000 interfaith dialogues around the country using film, one of our films, as the basis, right? Because what we felt was, being interfaith workers ourselves, and there's a number of people in our staff are interfaith. They're not just filmmakers. They're one of actually the person who pushes that program for us is an interfaith, mainly an interfaith guy, and a Christian. He's not a Muslim. The the impediment to interfaith dialogue is people are not at the same level of understanding about the topic.
Mhm.
So someone says what they think about this, say Islam, something about Islam, and somebody who's an expert says, no, you're all wrong, and X, Y, and Z, and it kind of ends a dialogue.
Mhm.
There's no dialogue there because now the person feels like, I don't know anything. So the idea really was have it bring people together around a movie. Everyone else had the same experience.
Mhm.
Now we start to dialogue around the movie. How did the movie make them feel? What ideas, what thoughts came up for them? What did they learn? And now people are sharing, and we would see that in practice when we tried that out. So that was what we were trying to do. 20,000 was at that time another Canadian, Malcolm Gladwell. We were very much under the spell of his. I forget the book. What was the title of the book? The tipping point. We were very much under the spell of the tipping point. That after you get a certain number of people, it tips things in that direction, and so we kind of arbitrarily decide 20,000 dialogues was that. So now to your question, to your point of how do you get people who are not necessarily believers, what's the expression, outside the choir, to be a part. We did that mainly through making, probably had about 300 altogether alliances we made, partnerships we made with different groups who could reach audiences that we ourselves couldn't reach, could reach some of those target audiences, and that's how we were able to get it out. And we did achieve the goal of 20,000 dialogues. I don't know if we hit the tipping point, but we did hit that goal, and we've made many others. Like, for example, a project that we're working on right now around the Lamya's poem, the animated film, was called Unfold Your Own Myth. And it has to do with, at the end of the film, we have a quote by Rumi, actual quote by Rumi, where he's saying, now you've seen the story, how things have gone with others. Go out and unfold your own myth. Mm. And so this idea of taking agency over your own story. And so we've developed this project aimed at-risk youth, for them through poetry to try to take control of their. So we're talking about refugees, we're talking about immigrant children, we're talking about, and some. We recently had a group that was from a juvenile detention home, Muslim youth, African American youth, but at-risk people whose society or experiences is telling them who they are, right? Telling them the story, and we're trying to give an empowerment where they can tell their own story, unfold their own myth, so and find agency and a positive path forward in their own experiences, their own lives.
Another project that you're working on right now, or has recently been completed and ready for launch, it's called The Great Muslim American Road Trip on PBS, which, as we mentioned off the hop, includes 2019 Mosquers alumni Mona Hayder. So tell us a little bit more about that project, how it came to be, and how you got involved with it.
Well, long story short, we were looking to tell a story of the American Muslim experience. I mean, in a way, our first film, Muhammad Legacy of the Prophet, which we told through the lens of American Muslims, was telling a story about Muslims right after 9/11. Mm-hmm. 20 years now have passed, and we've told stories about Islamic art and stories from history and stories about. We did a film based on a Gallup poll of Muslim public opinion, and so on and so forth. So kind of like 20 years later, it was sort of like, let's go back to the American Muslim story and see where American Muslims are today. That was the original idea.
Mm-hmm.
But what I found really was that there was a generational split. There are people kind of my generation and older who was seeing the situation in a certain way, but there are people maybe of your generation, younger, who were much more um, demonstrative about their Muslimness, much more demonstrative about their American and Muslimness together, um, uh, more energetic, for lack of a better word, more part of the culture, the pop culture of America. And so I felt like 20 years later, rather than having, a bunch of people with gray beards like me and talking and this and that, that we needed to look at this new generation who were the Muslims of the post 9/11 period, some of them were born after 9/11, and what was their story? What was that about? So that was like the next step in it. And then it was sort of like to fit, kind of like, again, like format follows, you know, form to a degree. And it was sort of like the nature of that story seemed to be an active one, a dynamic one. And so the idea was, let's make a road trip.
Mm.
Let's take a Muslim couple of a certain generation and have them do a road trip. And in fact, let's have them do an iconic road trip. I don't know if your Canadian audience is familiar with Route 66, but Route 66 is a very famous, iconic highway in America that goes from Chicago to Los Angeles. It's almost 3,000 miles. And we thought we'll take them along that. They're going to go past some iconic landscapes. And at the time, I didn't realize how much of the Muslim story could be found on this road. But the idea was, and let them find what there is to find in Muslim story. Well, it turns out that almost every stop, almost everything we passed had a connection to Muslims in America in some way, either past, present, or future. And so anyway, that became the Route 66. So it's a 3-part series. The first episode was on July 5th. The second episode will be like 12th and the 19th. I'm not sure, in some cases, you folks in Canada are able to get PBS. In some cases, you're not.
Oh, yeah.
But you can stream it on the PBS website, which I think you can get, pbs.org. It's right on the homepage, so you can stream the episodes. And you can, and as you mentioned, Mona was one of your alumni. She's a rap star, very energetic. We use a lot of her music in the film, and we use a lot of music in general. So it's not a documentary, even typical the kind we've made in the past. This is a high energy, fun, and informative, but fun. It's a road trip, and so our audience is kind of in the back seat with this kind of interesting couple. Going along on this journey of discovery.
And did you have safety concerns at all, particularly with Mona as someone who wears a hijab? How curated were the places that you stopped and the people that you spoke with?
Yeah, so keep in mind that COVID was happening while we were filming. So, I mean, though Omicron, we were before Omicron spike, but Delta was still present. So we practiced many safety protocols around that. We were also, 3,000-mile journey, so there was also safety protocols around simply taking 5 vehicles because we had, production cars and cars carrying supplies and stuff. So we had to take certain precautions, but we did not expect to, nor did we encounter, um, hostility or prejudice or things that felt threatening at any point. There were maybe a couple squirmy moments. I mean, there was a time where we parked to kind of bring everybody together and happened to look across the road and noticed the house had Confederate flags draping it. But we, so that was a little bit, but there wasn't any moment where we felt. Now, saying that, I'm not a hijabi woman, right? And I do know that Mona did feel uncomfortable from time to time, just because she stands out, and we were in some environments where seeing a person in hijab might be unusual. But I don't believe that we experienced anything that I could. And so we didn't. So to answer your question, no, we didn't curate. The only thing we really curated was that we did have, when we were moving along the trip and deciding we were going to stop here and hey, there's someone we're going to meet, we did insist that anybody that we were interacting with either was vaccinated or could show a negative.
Mm-hmm.
And in some cases they couldn't or they wouldn't, and we didn't in the end talk to them. But mostly they did.
So most of the safety concerns were more COVID related. Sounds
Yes.
like. Yeah. So
I mean, you get the vision sometimes that America is a very hostile place, but the thing about America that's different than some other cultures. I'm talking about, like, I think of many of my South Asian friends who come from uh, backgrounds, where there's hatred, deep seated hatred between Muslims and Hindus and other faith groups, right? Americans, by and large, want to like each other. They want to, they don't want to dislike each other. They want to like each other. They want to feel a sense of unity. And this period of divisiveness that we're going through right now in America is so painful for everybody because of that inclination that everyone has. Whatever side of the spectrum you're on, you want to believe that everyone else thinks like you. You don't want to believe, no, they don't think like me and I hate them. You want to think that they do. And so this divisiveness that we're experiencing is so painful to Americans, largely because it's out of our nature to be like that. So we frequently, and I'm not talking about just on the road trip, but just, the work that I do, I'm often I'm often expecting something negative that never materializes. One of the films that we were screening pretty widely was the data film on the Gallup, what Muslims really think, and the Fort Hood shootings happened in the midst of all that. And in fact, we had a screening the day after that, and I really thought, oh, this is going to be a very hostile audience. And I was screening this in West Virginia, so my own prejudices and stereotypes about the kinds of audiences I would encounter in West Virginia were very much in play. And I looked out at this audience, and at least by their appearance, they all fit my stereotypes, But in fact, they were a very appreciative audience, a very great, and some of them had a few tough questions, but I was reminded of that inherent goodness and the inherent desire of Americans to really want to like one another. So,
yeah, it's interesting. We've had this conversation again with others where some of the challenges and backlashes of these, of portrayals of Muslim stories or, by Muslim filmmakers, some of the most vocal backlash isn't necessarily from the non-Muslim community, but from within our own community, because we are oftentimes our own harshest critics because, this wasn't represented exactly the way I practice or exactly the way that I interpret this to be. And so has that been something that you've had to deal with as well through your work, or has that also been a pleasant surprise that has stayed kind of?
I mean, to a large degree, I mean, I, I know that when I make any film, so let's keep it focused in the Muslim space, since that's your question. There's going to be a group of people who are going to think it's the greatest thing ever done. And then there's going to be a group of people who are going to think it's awful and there was something really wrong about it. And what I'm always paying attention to is that middle group. That large. If you think of the bell curve, that middle group, where are they? Are they generally appreciative? Do we generally fulfill our mission? And the answer usually is yes. That isn't to say that sometimes I am buttonholed sometimes, and someone is suspicious of why we said it this way or why we showed. I remember once somebody being upset because in the background there was a Starbucks cup, and felt like we had purposely, we were trying to say something with that Starbucks cup being in the background, and we weren't. We didn't even realize it was there until someone pointed it out. But largely no. I mean, it hasn't been the case. Now, that isn't to say that the backlash, or that doesn't say that there are voices. I mean, I think the biggest impediment to Muslims outside of, in the diaspora unifying together is the thing that you're pointing out, which is that um, there is this that's kind of embedded in the religion, this idea there's a right way to do everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so then the debates become, what is the right way? And when you believe that there is really only one right way to do something, right, then that becomes these extreme divisive debates, right, that happens, that keeps women who cover their hair apart from women who don't cover their hair, or people who practice this way apart from somebody who practices that way, or Shiites versus Sunnis, or different kind of Sunnis, or so on and so forth, right? And so whereas, it's so interesting because coming to the religion as I did, in essence, free of that baggage, right? I wasn't raised in any context or any Muslim context. I didn't have someone telling me you must pray this way, or you must do this, or I wasn't surrounded only by women who covered their hair or dressed a certain way, or vice versa. I've always sort of had a much more broad uh, sense of what Islam is. To me, Islam has always been a big tent. It's never been, and I've always felt extremely comfortable both with with everybody. I've never really felt more comfortable with one group versus another group. I've felt comfortable with almost every group I've ever encountered. From very religious to very, for lack of a better, progressive to, I've been in groups of women who are, wear niqab, and groups of women who, are completely in Western dress. And I don't feel any sense of judgment, and I don't feel any judgment coming from them towards me either. Maybe just because of how I'm able to interact. So, that would be one message I would like to give Muslims, as somebody who came to Islam as an adult and seeing it through those eyes, without the baggage of culture, 20 years of culture being implanted on me. I see a religion that, as I said in the beginning, what's what attracted me. I see a religion that's very broad, a religion that seeks to unify, that embraces a lot of diversity, and is open to a wide, a wide expression of belief and actions. And I think that it's something that Muslims should welcome, even though it's different. And I think that the generation, again, this was also why I wanted to focus on a younger generation. I think that your generation is more like that. And I think that the generation that is more my age is more the generation that has some of these divisive problems. So I think that it's only going to get better. Uh, the way that Muslim to Muslim interaction is only going to get better uh,
Yeah.
as the time goes on.
Yeah. You've had, a 20+ year career in filmmaking. You've had an incredible career in policy. What is the one thing that you're most proud of?
uh, well, this might be disappointing. I don't know, but honestly, it's my children, and I don't mean that in a trite way. I said in the beginning, I come from, my parents were divorced, but more than that, my father abandoned us after the divorce. So I didn't have a father growing up, and that was it plunged our family, meaning my mother and my sister and I, into poverty. Um, and it was, being abandoned by a parent is a very painful experience. So when I got married and then had children, just it became the most important thing in my life, was to be a father, and to be the father I never had. And so that has really, I mean, and I was saying to my older son recently that it's interesting because I've had a lot of these great successes, but I don't really feel them. You know what I'm saying? I do the work because I believe in the work, but I don't feel, oh wow, I was at the State Department, I did this, I made this film, I've had this huge audience. My emotional life is mainly tied up with my children. And are they doing well? Are they succeeding? And It's what are the challenges they're facing, and how can I help them recover or get over those challenges. So the thing that I'm most proud of, and that's why I know the question you're looking for, like an answer of something I did.
No, that's great.
It's really much more about my family and my children that I'm most, and they're, alhamdulillah, they're all doing well in their own ways. They're very different. They have very different arcs. They're doing very different things, but all of them are doing things I'm very proud of. So that's my answer.
Right on.
That's a beautiful answer.
100%. Before we wrap, Alex, we like to end with a little bit more of a casual, fun ending with some rapid fire questions. Are you down?
Sure. Or like
right.
one-word answers.
One word. First thing that comes to your mind. No wrong answers.
They can be multiple words, but just rapid.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because I'm answering every question with like a 10-minute speech. I'm not very good at
That's cool, man.
It's all good. We're on your clock.
Yeah. Okay, so the first one is, what is your favorite comic book of all time?
We know you're a big
Conan the Barbarian.
Conan the Barbarian. Okay. What about the movie adaptation?
I love that movie adaptation only because I love Conan the Barbarian.
Fair enough. Second question. What's the first concert you ever attended?
Chicago.
Oh, okay.
Nice.
Interesting.
What's your most rewatched movie?
The Graduate. Or The Deer Hunter. One of those two.
Oh, right on. Good stuff. A movie or TV show that traumatized you as a child?
The Exorcist.
Oh yeah, that would definitely work. Yep.
And last question, what is your favorite way to eat potatoes?
To eat potatoes?
Yeah, so like fries.
Mashed potatoes soaking in butter.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, excellent.
Right on.
Excellent.
Amazing. Alex, thank you so much for your time and sharing all of your insights with us today. As you've already mentioned, available right now on PBS in the United States, hopefully also in Canada, and online is The Great Muslim American Road Trip. How can people find your other works and other projects?
Yeah, just go to our website, UPF, Unity Productions Foundation, UPF.tv. And that will take you to all of our other films, all of our outreach projects, the work. There's a lot of resources on that website.
Fantastic.
Awesome.
Fantastic. Alex, thank you again so much for your time.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of The Halal Gap. Stay tuned for more episodes and follow our brand new Instagram page at @thehalal_gap. The Halal Gap is a Mosquers production. You can find the Mosquers on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok by searching Mosquers Film Festival. Thank you to our sound and video editor, Vikram Chouhan, our tile artist, Narmeen Saiyed, and our producer, Asif Quraishi. Please rate us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and if you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. If you have any questions or comments about our podcast, you can email Asif at themosquers.com. On behalf of Sikandar and myself, thank you for joining us. Catch you next time.